It's Sunday morning in Toronto. Sarah's alarm goes off at 8:15. She hits snooze not once, but 3 times. Her Bible sits on the nightstand, a bookmark permanently lodged at Philippians 4:13. It hasn't moved in 6 weeks. Her church clothes hang in the closet, perfectly pressed, waiting. But Sarah, she's making coffee and opening her laptop. This isn't rebellion, it's resignation, and she's not alone. Across Canada, something extraordinary is happening in the pews. Every Sunday, hundreds of thousands of seats sit empty, seats that were once occupied by women. Not just any women, devoted women. Sunday school teachers, choir members, volunteer coordinators. The backbone of Canadian Christianity is quietly walking away, and most people haven't even noticed yet. The numbers are staggering. In 1985, 63% of Canadian women identified as religious. By 2019, that number had plummeted to just 28%. That's a drop of 35 percentage points in barely 3 decades. To put that in perspective, if this were a stock market crash, we'd be talking about it for generations. But because it's happening quietly, one Sunday at a time, it's become the silent exodus nobody wants to discuss. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. It's not just that women are leaving, it's how they're leaving. There are no dramatic exits, no manifestos, no public declarations. These women simply fade. They go from attending every week to missing one Sunday, then 2, then a month. Before anyone realizes they're gone. And when someone finally asks where they are, oh, she's been busy. Work has been crazy. Family stuff. The reasons are always vague, always polite, always designed to avoid confrontation. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shape our world. I'm bringing you into the heart of one of Canada's most profound social transformations. And trust me, this goes deeper than you think. Margaret was 72 when she stopped going to church. 72. She'd attended the same Presbyterian church in Halifax for 47 years. She'd taught Sunday school to 3 generations of children. She'd organized bake sales, coordinated funerals, and knew every hymn in the book by heart. Her grandmother had been a founding member of that congregation in 1923, and one Sunday in 2016, Margaret simply didn't show up. When the pastor called, she was polite but firm. "I'm done." When he asked why, she said something that still echoes. "I finally realized I was holding up a building that would never hold me up." What did she mean? To understand Margaret's words, we need to go back. Way back. To understand why women are leaving, you first need to understand why they stayed. For most of Canada's history, the church wasn't just a place of worship, it was the social infrastructure. Before community centers, before social services, before government welfare programs, there was the church. And running that infrastructure? Women. While men held the titles, reverend, elder, deacon, women held everything else together. They organized the meals that fed the poor, they visited the sick, they taught the children. They created the networks that held communities together during the Depression, during the wars, during every crisis Canada has ever faced. But here's the thing about invisible labor. It's invisible. A study from the University of British Columbia in 2018 found that women in Canadian churches contributed an average of 12.3 hours per week to church activities. Men, 3.7 hours. Women were doing more than 3 times the work, but when it came to decision-making, leadership positions, and recognition, the ratio flipped. Dr. Pamela Dickey-Young, a researcher at Queen's University who spent a decade studying women's participation in Canadian churches, discovered something remarkable. She interviewed over 300 women who had left various denominations between 2010 and 2020. When asked what finally made them leave, the number one answer wasn't theology. It wasn't science. It wasn't even abuse scandals, though those certainly played a role. The number one answer was exhaustion. Jennifer, a 43-year-old former United Church member from Calgary, put it this way: "I spent 20 years being told my spiritual gifts were hospitality and service. But every time I suggested we change how we did something, I was told I wasn't being submissive. Every time I questioned a decision, I was being divisive. I could work myself to death for the church, but I couldn't lead it. One day I realized I was teaching my daughter that this was normal. That was the day I knew I had to leave. The generational shift is perhaps the most telling part of this story. Older women like Margaret stayed for decades despite frustrations because church was inseparable from community, from identity, from purpose. But their daughters and granddaughters, they had options. They had careers. They had social networks outside the church. They had less tolerance for being told their value was limited to supporting roles. Statistics Canada data from 2021 reveals that among women aged 18 to 34, only 14% regularly attend religious services. 14%. Their grandmother's generation? 73%. We're talking about a collapse so complete, so total, that within 2 generations the default shifted from attendance to absence. Before we go further, I'm curious, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing our global community come together around these stories. And if you're finding value in this deep dive, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us keep creating content that goes beyond the surface level. Now, you might be thinking, surely the church has noticed this exodus. Surely they tried to stop it, and you'd be right. Sort of. Many denominations did try to respond, but here's where the story takes a twist that's almost tragic in its irony. In 2015, the Anglican Church of Canada commissioned a major study on declining female membership. The recommendations were clear: increase women's leadership, address gender imbalance in decision-making, create more flexible volunteer structures that acknowledged women's work-life balance. Reasonable suggestions, right? But here's what actually happened in many dioceses. They created committees to study the recommendations. Committees that were overwhelmingly led by men. They organized conferences to discuss women's concerns. Conferences where the keynote speakers were, you guessed it, mostly men. Father Thomas, a Catholic priest in Montreal who spoke on condition that we change his name, told researchers something revealing in 2019. We kept asking women to tell us what they needed to stay, and they kept telling us, but we wanted them to need things we were comfortable giving. When they said they needed equality in leadership, we offered them more appreciation. When they said they needed authority, we offered them more opportunities to serve. We were solving a problem they weren't having while ignoring the one they were. But it's not just about leadership. The theology itself became a breaking point for many women, and this is where the Canadian exodus differs from similar movements in the United States. Canadian women weren't just leaving conservative churches, though they absolutely were. The data shows a 52% decline in female attendance at evangelical churches between 2000 and 2020. But they were also leaving progressive churches. The United Church of Canada, one of the most liberal denominations in the world, lost 41% of its female congregants in the same period. Even progressive theology, it turned out, often meant progressive ideas discussed by the same old voices. Rachel, a 36-year-old PhD candidate in theology from Vancouver, explained it this way: I could handle the intellectual arguments against women's equality. I'd studied them, I could debate them. What I couldn't handle was the casual, everyday diminishment. The way my ideas would be ignored in a church meeting until a man repeated them. The way I was expected to be grateful for being allowed to volunteer. The emotional labor of constantly having to prove my worth in a space that claimed to see me as equal in God's eyes but unequal in practice. The emotional labor piece is crucial. Dr. Susan Wilhock from Atlantic School of Theology in Nova Scotia conducted interviews with 200 women who left churches between 2012 and 2018. 91% mentioned emotional exhaustion as a factor. They described being the ones expected to smooth over conflicts, to manage relationships, to sense when someone was struggling and provide support. One woman described it as being the church's unpaid therapist, event planner, and janitor all at once. And then COVID-19 happened. If the exodus was a stream before 2020, the pandemic turned it into a flood. When churches closed their doors in March 2020, something unexpected occurred. Women who had been attending out of habit, obligation, or social pressure suddenly had permission to stop. And when churches reopened, many of these women simply didn't come back. A 2022 Angus Reid poll found that of Canadians who stopped attending church during the pandemic, 68% were women. Of those who hadn't returned by 2023, 74% were women. But here's the twist that researchers didn't expect. Many of these women didn't stop being spiritual. They didn't abandon faith. They just abandoned the institution. The same surveys showed that 71% of women who left churches still considered themselves spiritual. 53% still prayed regularly. 42% still read religious texts. They just did it at home, in nature, or in small informal groups with other women. Maria, a 51-year-old former Catholic from Ottawa, started what she calls a kitchen church in 2021. 8 women meet in her home every Sunday morning. They read scripture, discuss spiritual questions, share communion. No priest, no hierarchy, no one telling them their voices matter less. When asked if she missed her old church, she laughed. I miss the idea of what I thought it was, but this is what I was searching for all along. A space where my faith and my dignity could coexist. These informal spiritual communities are spreading across Canada. They're not organized. They're not affiliated with denominations. They're often invisible to traditional religious surveys. But they exist, thousands of them. Women gathering in living rooms, coffee shops, hiking trails, creating their own spiritual practices that honor their experiences. The institutional response has been, at best, confused. Some churches have tried to modernize. The Presbyterian Church in Canada appointed its first female moderator in 2019. Several Catholic dioceses have created women's councils with advisory roles. Evangelical churches have started women's ministries focused on female-specific concerns. But for many women, these gestures feel too little, too late. Linda, who left a Baptist church in Saskatoon after 32 years, put it bluntly. They want us back because the churches are emptying and the money's drying up. They're not interested in actually changing the power structures. They just want us to return to keeping the machine running. But we're done being fuel for a system that burns us out. The financial impact of women's exodus cannot be overstated. A 2020 study by the Canadian Council of Churches found that women historically contributed 59% of volunteer hours and 43% of financial donations to Canadian churches. When women leave, they don't just take themselves. They take their labor, their money, and often their children. This brings us to perhaps the most profound consequence of this exodus: the generational break. When mothers leave the church, their children rarely come back. Statistics Canada data shows that 87% of young adults who are religiously unaffiliated had mothers who either left the church or were inconsistent attenders during their childhood. The transmission of faith, it turns out, flows primarily through maternal lines. Break that line, and you break the chain. We're now witnessing the first generation of Canadian children being raised by women who were deeply religious, became disillusioned, and consciously chose to raise their children outside of organized religion. These mothers often describe their decision in terms of protection. They're protecting their daughters from the diminishment they experienced. They're protecting their sons from learning that women's voices matter less. But not all women leave. Some stay and fight from within. The Women's Interchurch Council of Canada has been pushing for systemic change since 1918, and their work has intensified in recent years. They've lobbied for female ordination in resistant denominations, challenged sexist theological interpretations, and created alternative power structures within traditional frameworks. Reverend Sarah Johnson, one of the first female ministers in the Canadian Reformed tradition, ordained in 2018 after decades of prohibition, represents this internal resistance. Some women leave and find their spiritual home elsewhere, she said in a 2021 interview. But I stay because I believe the church can change, will change, must change, because if it doesn't, it won't survive. And I think that would be a loss, despite everything. Her perspective represents a minority view among younger women, but an important one. There are women who believe the institution is worth saving, worth reforming, worth the fight. But even these women acknowledge the cost. Reverend Johnson herself admitted to experiencing burnout, facing resistance from male colleagues, and sometimes questioning whether the struggle was sustainable. The denominations themselves are now facing an existential crisis. The United Church of Canada projects that at current rates of decline, 73% of their congregations will close by 2040. The Anglican Church of Canada has closed over 800 churches since 2001. The Catholic Church in Canada has shuttered over 300 parishes in the last decade. And while they rarely say it publicly, internal documents obtained by researchers show they understand that the loss of women is the primary driver. An internal memo from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops in 2019, leaked to the press, stated, "The departure of women represents our greatest crisis. Without women, we have no Sunday schools, no social programs, no community infrastructure. We must find ways to make women feel valued." But the memo itself was written by a committee of bishops, all male. The irony was not lost on observers. What makes the Canadian situation unique compared to similar trends in the United States, Europe, or Australia is the speed and silence of the exodus. In America, women leaving churches often becomes a public conversation, with books, movements, and vocal advocacy. In Canada, it's happened with remarkable quietness. Canadian women, shaped by a culture that values politeness and conflict avoidance, have left without fanfare. They've simply stopped showing up. This cultural dimension matters because it means many churches are in denial about the scope of the problem. When someone leaves loudly, you have to respond. When they leave quietly, you can pretend they're just busy, just going through a phase, just temporarily absent. Canadian churches have been able to maintain this pretense for longer than their American counterparts, which means they're further behind in addressing root causes. The COVID-19 pandemic, paradoxically, may have been a gift in disguise. It made the exodus visible. When pews were empty because of lockdowns, churches could blame government restrictions. But when restrictions lifted and the pews stayed empty, and those empty seats were disproportionately where women used to sit, denial became harder. Some churches have begun radical experiments. A Lutheran congregation in Edmonton abolished all gender-specific roles in 2021. A Catholic parish in Toronto created a women's advisory council with actual voting power on budget and program decisions, unprecedented in Catholic governance. An evangelical church in British Columbia implemented a rule that no committee or leadership team could be more than 60% one gender. These experiments are too new to evaluate their success, but they represent something significant, an acknowledgement that business as usual means institutional death. Whether these changes are enough to bring women back remains to be seen. Many of the women I've mentioned, Sarah, Margaret, Jennifer, Rachel, Linda, Maria, when asked if such changes would bring them back, expressed skepticism. "Maybe for the next generation," several said, "but for me, that ship has sailed." There's also a class dimension to this exodus that's rarely discussed. Working class and immigrant women have left churches at even higher rates than middle class women. A 2021 study from the University of Toronto found that women who worked multiple jobs or irregular hours were the fastest growing demographic of departures. Church schedules, which assume a Sunday morning availability that many working women don't have, became an insurmountable barrier. One woman working 3 part-time service jobs said simply, "The church talks about welcoming everyone, but the schedule says only if your life looks a certain way." Immigrant women, particularly from non-Christian backgrounds who converted or married into Christian families, reported feeling doubly marginalized by their ethnicity and their gender. They described being welcomed as long as they brought cultural diversity to potlucks, but excluded from real participation in church life. When they left, they often returned to the spiritual traditions of their heritage or created syncretic practices that blended multiple traditions. The question of what Canada loses when women leave the church is complex. Critics of organized religion might say, "Good riddance to patriarchal institutions." And there's truth to the idea that women escaping oppressive structures is progress. But there's also a loss that's harder to quantify. Churches, for all their flaws, provided community infrastructure that's not being replaced. When a church closes, it's not just a building that's lost. It's a food bank, a gathering space for seniors, a meeting place for community groups, a free counselor in the form of clergy. Women were the ones organizing these services. When they left, many of these services simply stopped. A 2020 report from Community Foundations of Canada found that neighborhoods with recently closed churches saw a 23% decrease in volunteer-run social services. The women who used to provide these services were now providing them elsewhere in secular contexts, or they were too burned out to provide them at all. But women themselves report gaining something profound in leaving themselves. Over and over in interviews and surveys, women describe reclaiming time, energy, and identity. They describe no longer performing a version of spirituality that required them to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating. They describe finding spiritual practices that celebrate rather than constrain their full humanity. Samantha, a 29-year-old who left an evangelical church in Winnipeg at age 24, said, "I was taught that my body was dangerous, my mind was suspect, and my purpose was support. When I left, I had to rebuild my entire sense of self. It took 3 years of therapy and a lot of unlearning. But now, I have a spirituality that includes all of me, my intellect, my sexuality, my ambition, my doubts. I would never go back to fragmenting myself for institutional approval." The future of Canadian Christianity, then, is being written by the absence of women. Some predictions are dire. Demographic projections suggest that if current trends continue, regular church attendance in Canada could drop below 5% of the population by 2050. Women's exodus accelerates this timeline. Other forecasters are more optimistic, believing that the crisis will force necessary reforms, that churches will adapt or die, and that adaptation might create something worth returning to. What's certain is that the church women knew, the one their grandmothers built, their mothers sustained, and they were expected to maintain, is disappearing. Whether what emerges from the ashes will be worthy of women's return is an open question. Some women are waiting to see. Some women have stopped caring. And some women are building entirely new spiritual communities that don't require institutional permission to exist. The really interesting part? Many of the women who've left still believe. They still pray. They still seek transcendence and community and meaning. They've just concluded that the institution claiming to offer these things was, in fact, the obstacle to finding them. They've done what millions of people throughout history have done when faced with systems that diminish them. They've walked away in search of something better. And they're finding it, just not where the church expected. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who appreciates depth over sound bites, and that's exactly what we do here at Professor Archive. If this exploration resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more investigations into the forces shaping our world, and drop a comment about your own observations or experiences. What profession are you in? And has your work given you insight into this phenomenon? As for Sarah, the woman we met at the beginning, still hitting snooze on Sunday mornings, last I heard, she'd joined a women's meditation group that meets on Saturday afternoons. They discuss philosophy, spirituality, and life. No one tells her what to believe. No one diminishes her questions, and she's never felt more spiritually alive. Make of that what you will.